Okay, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Jess, and I'm an engineer at Dyson. We've got a really exciting session for you today. First, we're going to have a little discussion on the topic of clean living starts indoors. Then we'll be moving through to the second session to reveal our latest innovations. And then there'll be a chance for you guys to get a bit hands-on with some demos and experience the tech yourself. I'd just like to say, feel free to jump in if you have any questions throughout the discussion. We can keep this quite interactive. So I'm really pleased to introduce three special guests with me today. We have Dr. Carmel Harrington, who's a sleep expert with a PhD in sleep medicine from Sydney University and consults with companies and educational institutions both here and overseas on sleep health. We have Professor John Bell, who's the Head of Science and Engineering at Queensland University of Technology and an indoor environment and building specialist. And we also have Dr. Cheryl Van Noonan, who is a clinical allergist and a regular authority with the National Asthma Council of Australia. So springtime is upon us, and we all want to sort of refresh and have a big clean in our homes. And in fact, a recent Dyson study has shown that 43% of Aussies agree with doing a big spring clean. So for many of us, that might mean throwing out old clothes, moving the furniture so we can vacuum properly, and getting rid of lingering house dust. But something people don't tend to attempt or even consider is to clean out air as well. And ahead of hay fever season, with spring in the air, we're here today to discuss air quality, how a clean indoor environment has a big impact on our daily lives, and what improvements we can make to it. We obviously spend a large amount of our time indoors, so we think this is quite a big and important topic. Something that's increasingly talked about is indoor air pollution, which can be up to 5 times worse than outdoor air pollution. In our Dyson study, the findings actually showed that 37% of respondents didn't know what that means, so we're going to start off by explaining that. So, Professor Bell, as an air quality specialist, can you tell us a bit about what air quality is and what indoor air pollution is, what creates it?
So, air pollution, inside and outside, is exactly the same. It's things in the air that you don't normally expect to breathe. That can be particles, that can be dust particles or dust mites, it can be pollen from outdoors, it can be emissions from materials inside the house, and sometimes things we bring into the house. Everyday cleaning products all contain organic solvents of some sort, perfumes are the same. All of those things are effectively pollutants inside the house.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit about how it's measured and what those particle sizes might be?
So you've got two different types. You've got the volatile organic carbons, and you measure those by actually measuring particular characteristics of those chemicals. Fairly straightforward. Typically you can actually do that with a simple device. Particle measurements are a little bit more complicated. Getting good, accurate distributions of particle sizes is quite difficult, but there are some simple devices that can actually measure the amount of particles. A really simple way is just to filter air through a filter paper and to actually literally observe what you're actually seeing on the filter paper. Some of us might not like to do that. Don't go into the M5 and try and measure the air quality because you'd be shocked.
It's why they say to turn the windows up and you recycle it icon on.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. So what kind of particle sizes might we be talking about?
There's a lot of different particle sizes. Large particles like pollens can be an issue because they're very allergenic, but smaller particles often are very, very chemically reactive, and these are things that are as small as 5 to 10 nanometers in size, up to a lot more particles around the 1 to 10 micron in size. These are really quite small, the size of a human hair, but just a very small particle.
Okay. And we talked a little bit before about the new technology that's coming out to measure these particles. Could you tell us a bit about that?
So there's a group of people who I work with at QUT who are developing handheld sensors to be able to actually measure particulate pollution using a mobile phone. So just take your iPhone and stick an attachment into it to be able to measure particulate pollution. This is being developed largely because there's a huge demand for it in China.
What kind of unusual sources might we find inside the homes that people wouldn't know about?
All of our furniture has been treated with chemicals. Any cleaning products you use. So almost anything that has a perfume, that's an organic molecule that's coming off into the air. The fact that you can smell it means it's in the air. It doesn't mean it's dangerous, but continued and prolonged exposure to many of those things can be dangerous. And so they're some of the things, anything you bring into the house potentially is a pollutant and not something that we should be exposed to on a continuous basis.
And what kind of research has there been about the indoor environment in Australia?
There's indoor environment research it's really only something that kicked off about 30 years ago, 30 to 40 years ago as a topic of importance. There hasn't been a lot of work done on indoor air quality in Australia, but there have been some recent studies that have been done in Brisbane looking at schools and the impact of particles on school children. Two particularly important results out of that. One is a lot of the really difficult pollutants for people to handle come from the outside. There's a lot of the organic chemicals that we bring into the house ourselves, but in terms of particles, they mostly come from the outside. And that can have a measurable impact on the children's health. Well, not so much the health, but biomarkers indicating that there may be health consequences. So very early stage. Not actually saying it's making them sick, but their body is starting to respond, which suggests that if there's a long-term exposure, that's something that you could talk about much better than I could.
It's interesting also when you talk about the upregulation of those biomarkers. There's something that's not good for the body, the inflammatory cytokines, and our body works hard to sort of counteract that. So these kids could be feeling sort of their quality of life could be impaired rather than being overtly sick. Would they exhibit things like lethargy or things like that?
There was no measurable impact on gross behaviour, as far as we could tell from the study that was reported about 5 years ago. But the problem is it because of the atmosphere? There's a correlation between the two.
Yeah.
If that is long term, then that could seriously impact on people's health for that reason.
Yeah, so Cheryl, obviously we know there's a lot of people that suffer from hay fever, 18% of Australians, but what kind of things can we do to help our indoor air quality, and how can these poor air quality things affect our allergies?
I think the first point to discuss, Jess, would be the fact that Australia is one of the areas in the world which is well known for having a high prevalence of asthma, a very high prevalence of rhinitis. For example, in Tasmania, it's gone from 20% of people to 40% of people in a single generation in one study. So I think we've got a lot of people. So when you have asthma, about 80% of people have an allergic trigger. And when you have rhinitis, then allergic triggers for rhinitis are usually things like house dust mite. House dust mite would be the number one enemy for both people with asthma and people with rhinitis. So they're about 0.3 millimetres, aren't they, the ones themselves? But then you've got the problem with, in a mattress you'll have something like 2 million house dust mites producing 20 fecal particles per day. So you've got 40 million per day. So, roll over in bed and you've created a shower of
and
these.
And they're much smaller.
They are. They're about 10 to 40 microns each, aren't they? And so they would need to be captured air quality-wise by...
If you can cover them up with a sheet, that works, but they'll get through.
That's right.
So you need to get rid of them.
Yeah, so that you can never entirely get rid of house dust mite by strict anti-house dust mite precautions, as you know. So it is important to be trying to reduce them even further in your atmosphere, particularly if you're exquisitely sensitive to them, as many people are. And that's just one type of allergen. You've got a lot of other things happening. So you've got animal danger, more people living in high rises, so there are more dogs and cats, and a number of places, one up just up the road, for example, Altair, they allow pets in their high rise. So they'd be living in smaller areas really than they were before, for example, in a house. and a lot of pets lived outside before, so there'd be sun coming in, but we had smaller windows, smaller doors than a lot of the apartments do these days, so you're actually getting a lot of outdoors, indoors, aren't you, through that. And while the UV might sort of do for a few of them through the window, it won't actually, it might be a sterile dust mite rather than a dirty dust mite, but it's still a dust mite. Dust mite is still an allergen. And one of the things about dust mites, if they're dead, they're still an allergen. In fact, everything, if it's dead, is still an allergen. If it's an allergen, even bee venom. And then, so you've got pet dander, and you can get rid of that. So if you've got a dog, then you're really able to suck up that dog hair and get it out of the atmosphere. If you've got a cat, you've got to wash it down. It's good to get rid of the particulate matter that cats make. And they also provide food, these animals, then, because dust might live on the fake human skin cells that we drop. So that's their food, with a little bit of mould thrown in, I think, as well, isn't it? And that's a bit of their vegetable. And so you've got that. And so, if they're dead, they're still an allergen. And so that when they reproduce, the fact that they die doesn't really make any difference. It just adds to the type of mite. So you've got dust mite, you've got pets, pollen's coming in. So, a lot of people, again, more people living in high-rise, so a lot of trees are being planted in urban areas to make them more livable. And so, for example, they are often they're planted so that you have a deciduous tree, and so you get the sunshine in winter through your lovely outdoors. Unfortunately, during spring, you get a healthy dose of tree pollen, and that is a short, sharp allergen which sets people off for up to 6 months with their asthma afterwards. So it's not just the time that the tree, for example, would be pollinating, and all the things that are not visible to us. And of course, you've got the diesel from living camel. It's not very good to live near major highways, is it?
Certainly not. It really does affect our sleep.
That's right.
For all sorts of reasons.
And then the diesel in that matter will massage the pollen to release more allergenic particles from ryegrass, for example, which is Melbourne work from the University of Melbourne Botany Department many years ago. So, and then along with that, as if that wasn't enough of a challenge for your air conditioning for your lungs, otherwise known as your nose, to try and cope with, to be dropping that particulate matter, humidifying and warming the air to optimise gas exchange in your lungs, you've then got moulds. So moulds can be coming from the outside in. Most of the allergenic moulds are actually outdoor moulds which have come in. Admittedly, it's not good to have mould in your home.
To have mould in the home, right.
And that your heating can create that by making the windows that drip in the mornings and that sort of thing. So the mould not only is an irritant and an allergen in some people, it also makes its own volatile organic compounds, I think, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's growing, so it's emitting all sorts of chemicals into the air.
So allergy is an emerging problem as well. So it started to emerge about 200 years ago with industrialisation. It wasn't really known before 1867 when Charles Blackley described hay fever. Asthma is becoming more of a problem. 1 in 4 little children, 1 in 7 teenagers, 1 in 10 adults living with asthma. And so air quality is very important for all of those people.
And Dr. Carmel, you mentioned just before then how this can start to affect our sleep, and who else can be impacted, and what does the effect of bad sleep have on our health?
Well, everybody can be affected by bad sleep. So we're all living animals. We all need to sleep, and we all need to sleep well. And so if we're not sleeping well, there's quite significant adverse health effects. And in the short term, we're more likely to develop colds and flus. We're also likely to be cranky and not think well the next day and poorly behave. In the long term, though, there are really significant effects that we're beginning to understand. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Cheryl's field of study has been around for 150, 200 years. John's field of study has been around for 30, 40 years, and my field of study, sleep's been only around about 50 years. But in that time, so much has been learned about sleep. And so if you're not sleeping well, you're twice as likely to develop a 50% increased risk of developing obesity or cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes, twice as likely to have a heart attack or stroke, 5 times more likely to develop depression and twice as likely to develop dementia or cognitive decline. So in the long term, our chronic health is really affected by lack of sleep, because sleep is fundamental to how well we think, act and feel. And an interesting fact that many of you may not know, if I deprive a rat totally of sleep, it will die quicker than if I totally deprive a rat of food. So sleep is more fundamental to our survival than food. And so that's something we should think about every night when we swap our sleep for wakefulness. And air quality is really important to how we sleep, but interestingly enough, this is stuff that's just beginning to emerge this century. It's not something that has been totally explored. And more, and I look at the literature, and it started off in little bits and pieces at the turn of the century, and there's masses coming out in the last 5 or 6 years, because we're beginning to understand that how we sleep is affected by the air quality, because it affects our breathing. And if we're not breathing properly when we sleep, we're not going to get good sleep.
I think that's a particular problem, Carmel, for children, in that a lot of people think that rhinitis is not much of a problem to have in life, but in actual fact, the quality of life surveys show that that's the worst problem. And then the children, there's stuffy in the nose, and it doesn't clear until about 10 o'clock in the morning after they get away from the allergens that are setting it off, and get upright to reduce the swelling in the nose by gravity. And they go to school, and usually maths is the first thing, or they do the hard things first in the morning. So these kids might as well not be there, because don't we load our memory during REM sleep, and these children are trying to learn their tables and things, and that's when they wake up in the early hours of the morning with their asthma or their rhinitis, because that's a bit lighter sleep in the times when it is lighter. Then you wake up a bit, and then if you wake up in REM, the lights are on, you don't get back to sleep, do you?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you think about allergens in the air, this is why clean air is so important. Because the nose is a fantastic filter. But once we start getting that blocked up, the first thing we do is so we start to take in all this dirty air like
Absolutely.
that. So what that causes is inflammation throughout the upper airway. And of course, once we have inflammation up the upper airway, we're not breathing the right amount of air in. So these kids are under ventilating, so they're not getting enough oxygen, and they can develop a particular type of disorder called sleep apnea. And we have that in children, all right? So people think it's the old male snoring away, but children have it as well. So if they've got this sort of disorder, and you can often see a child who's sleeping like this, with that mouth open. So to Cheryl's point, what happens to them, they find it, well, they actually can't maintain their dream sleep or their REM sleep, because you just can't, for physiological reasons. And this stage of sleep is absolutely fundamental to our cognitive health and our sense of well-being, because it's in REM sleep that we bed down our memory. Right? So what happens, the way it works is lots of memories during the day, which are essential to our memory. They go into the hippocampus, and when we go to sleep, they're then filed throughout the brain like a computer. And if we don't get the right amount of dream sleep, we have a 40% decrease in our encoding ability. So these poor children that have just hay fever, it's not just hay fever, it really affects their quality of life. And don't forget, we've got a child that's having hypoxic episodes or lack of oxygen during their sleep on a developing brain and body. This happens to adults as well, of course, but we're seeing this in diagnosis of attention deficit, because when a child's tired, as opposed to an adult who sits in a corner and wants to fall asleep, the child acts out, and they're troublesome, and they're not well behaved, and of course they're not taking in their lessons. So clean air.
A lot of that behaviour is actually taking the attention away from what the real problem is, in that they can't remember the table that they've been asked to recite,
and that's awful.
Or the work that they've been asked to do.
So their quality of
life, just going to make trouble to obfuscate it.
Well, that's right. And so the quality of life of these children, when it's measured, is poor. And that's not what we want. But it's also the same thing happens in adults. We're just beginning to recognise that what we see in the adult model is exacerbated in the child model.
And then if you don't get that REM sleep, you're more likely to be anxious and more likely to then become depressed. That's
Well,
my
that's absolutely
understanding.
right, because we reset, we do all sorts of things in our dream sleep that we can't do during the day. So we reset the brain, we do all sorts of, in fact, parts of our brain are more active in dream sleep than awake. And if you can see some brain scans, it's absolutely fascinating. Normally people go, oh my God, I can't believe my brain is so busy. And one of the parts of the brain that we reset is our emotional centre. And of course, if we don't get enough sleep, guess what? We're cranky, or we're more likely to get annoyed at people, or impatient, road rage. We've all experienced it. But it's not
Make
just us.
mistakes when you're driving.
Absolutely.
But,
The kids do.
but it's actually even worse because you start breathing through your mouth,
That's exactly right.
and then you're actually getting more
Right into your lungs.
straight into your lungs, more of the pollutants that are there. So if it's caused by pollutants, it can be caused by cold as well.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
if it's caused by pollutants, it ends up making it worse.
And
Well, with the
drying
cold.
up,
Yeah.
drying up the upper airway. Children have rhinovirus in their noses 80% of the time, which is why when they're like that, you see these sort of little kids who are obviously very swollen across here. And what happens then, 80% of them have rhinovirus, so they have one bad night's sleep and they have 9 to 11 viral respiratory infections per annum
Yes.
until they're about 9, which is
And on
just,
that point,
which then reinforces the problem because the nose is even more
well,
blocked.
that's right. But on that point, it's at night when we sleep that we fire up our immune system.
Absolutely.
And we have this fabulous system called killer cell activity that goes around and mops up all the rhinovirus and the cancer cells and things like that so that we remain healthy. But these poor children are getting poor sleep, so they're not getting the right amount of killer cell activity. And in fact, studies have shown that we get a 50% decrease in that activity when we're not sleeping well. So these children are much more susceptible.
So their surveillance mechanisms
That's
are
right.
just not there.
And John, you've done some research into how all of this links into productivity, how indoor air quality can link to that, right?
Yeah, so we did quite a big survey of all of the literature in this area from around the world, and it's very clear that productivity, and this was looking mainly at office buildings rather than houses, productivity is very much related to the quality of the indoor environment. Apparently a worse boss is the biggest problem, but let's take that out of the equation. If you've got an environment that has fresh air with good amounts of oxygen and low CO2, you've got a good air conditioning system that doesn't introduce particles into the air, and let's not look at what's inside the air conditioning system because that can be a source of a problem in commercial buildings. And then you've got all the other parts of the environment as well. You've got to look after noise, you've got to look after light, but all these have a very significant impact on employee productivity in the workplace. And I think it's exactly the same when you get to a home as well.
Absolutely.
But we measure the productivity very differently there. And so these are really important drivers of the way in which we operate as people. And when we're in buildings, most of the time, the indoor environment is extremely important. And particles and organic pollutants play a really critical role in how we feel inside a building.
Of course, yeah. So, Dr. Harrington and Dr. Van Nuenen, do you have any tips on how we can make the optimum indoor environment in our homes, in our classrooms?
Well, the house dust mite's very much dependent on humidity. So if you drop the humidity, it dies. That's useful. And getting it out of the atmosphere would be the single best thing that we can do. Just removing those allergens from the atmosphere within the home would be very helpful. There's a huge economic cost. We actually spend more as a nation on treatment for allergy and asthma than we do on a defence budget. So we spend more on our immunological defence than we do on our national meds.
And I think the research is quite clear around the effect of cleaning the air, because the studies have shown that not only does air pollution increase the risk of this sleep apnea and the severity, and therefore increases the risk of, as I spoke earlier before to you about the heart attack risk. If we can clean the air, we actually decrease your susceptibility to this sleep apnea. And so you're much more likely to be able to sleep well and not have fragmented sleep. But there's more to sleep than just the clean air, which is really important. It needs to be dark, it needs to be cool, and it needs to be quiet. And sometimes we need things like fans, for example, or air conditioning will keep it cool, but a fan will cool the air and provide a white noise. So the white noise is very good at minimising the effect of other external noise. So have good sleep, you need those 4 things. Yeah.
And the reality is, the more you take things that we're not intended to breathe out of the atmosphere and make it easier for our
That's right.
internal air conditioner to work, then the better it's going to be.
I'm going to put the questions out to you guys now. If you have any questions for our panel, please feel free to get involved.
It's very hard to see, actually.
Yeah.
The more you take out, the better it is. Without pointing towards the Dyson product, which has got a filter and anti-pollutant, are there economic ways of taking that stuff out in a home, or in a large home or a small home?
Well, I think you pointed to one. Not having high humidity is really important. In high humidity, everything gets worse. You get more reactivity for the organic chemicals. You get particles growing faster in humid atmospheres. You get the moulds, the dust mites, they grow better in a humid atmosphere. So that points to air conditioning. It points to the appropriate level of ventilation. These are all really important things to be able to do. But ultimately, the only economical way to actually remove particles is to actually remove them. There's no other simple way of doing it. The outdoors pollution comes inside. So, if children have a problem when they go into the garden, they're going to have the same problem in the house. If you shut it up really tight, you create other problems. So you've got to do something to actually get rid of some of those particles.
Anyone else?
Hi, Alex Zaharovic from i2y.com. Things like diet must also play a role in some of the allergies. It's well known if you have too much milk, it's going to cause mucus, and some of these infections that kids are having must not only be caused by by the pollutants in the air, but by some of the unhealthy diets that we're all eating. And so it's obviously a combination of
There are many ways to make yourself sick.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to play that down. I think the important thing is, if you have things in the air, there will be a proportion of the population that are affected.
Absolutely. I think, to sort of further explore the point that you're making, we have never been more than now what we eat. So our internal milieu in our gut, as you know, our biome, really decides a lot of our immunological destiny and quite a few other things. So we have this huge tsunami of small children and mature people becoming more allergic to more things, and this is going on around the planet. And it's very likely happening because their immune system's being conditioned by a relative paucity of microorganisms in our gut, perhaps not having the right ones, and that's very much affected by diet. And so with milk will coat mucus. It doesn't make mucus, but it coats the mucus, and it makes the mucus feel thicker for that person. I mean, it's a semantic issue, really, isn't it? I mean, does milk make mucus? Well, that's how it does it. It coats it because it's tenacious in grabbing onto protein that's nearby. And so any secretions that you have, if you have a lot of milk, will be coated by that milk protein, and that will make you stuffy. And there are many people who are better off if they don't drink milk. Most of the population on the planet, the default position is not to have lactase. We actually don't need lactase after we stop breastfeeding. So none of the Africans have it virtually, and none of the Asians have it either. I mean, it's considered to be quite the norm not to have the enzyme in your gut that breaks down lactose after that. So Europeans have grown up differently, and so Caucasians often retain their lactase because it was a sort of cow and milk predominant society, because the ones that survived were the ones who could drink the milk and eat the cow, and they grew, higher and faster, and therefore survived better when infections came through. So I think that the gut does decide, and therefore food does decide in a way. Not all food is good for us.
I guess ultimately, if you're going to be healthy, it should be across the board.
Absolutely.
But
with any patient that I see, I ask them how long they sleep for, and I go through a dietary history. So the three things that decide how you go in life, in my opinion, are how well you sleep, how well you eat, and if you have rewarding work in your life. You can't depend on families on a daily basis, but they are very important.
But on that point, I'd like to point out that I believe, and I think a lot of medical people are coming to the same conclusion, that there's the three pillars of health. There's what you eat, it's how you exercise or your engagement with other things, and how you sleep. And sleep underpins a lot of those things. And diet is absolutely essential to how well we sleep, and we go back to the gut biome.
And when you
That's
eat, you're supposed to eat a bit forwards of when you go to sleep, aren't you, Carmen, I think? You're supposed to eat a couple of hours before you try and nod off, otherwise your gut's sort of working away and kicking you awake.
But I think there's no one thing. You should be aiming to get that all right. And so if you can improve this area, it enables you to improve this area and this area, because each area gives each other area strength. So I guess I come back to that all the
If
time.
you're feeling better after you sleep, then you're more likely to stick to healthy food.
Absolutely.
And you don't have that ghrelin going after the carbohydrate that's going to really complete the circle with type 2 diabetes and things like that.
There's all sorts of complications. So sleeping well really will put you in the best place possible.
And eating well.
So one other question. We're obviously here to learn about one of the new Dyson filters, but should people be running a filter 24/7? Should you be having a separate one in your bedroom? What's the best way to use a filtration system?
So I think we're going to cover that a little bit later in our session today.
Okay.
So hopefully we can answer that question soon. And I think we're actually going to have to leave this here now and take you through to section 2. So I'd just like to thank you guys so much for your input, and I hope you guys enjoyed